Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dan Geller from the Climate Learning Network. It's 1 p.m., so we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us. A few announcements before we get started today. The climate literacy certification that we've been talking about for a year is now finally in beta. So if you're interested in being a part of that, please email me at dgeller@uga.edu. That's DGELLER@uga.edu. I'll put that in the chat as well. We're looking for our first cohort to be a part of this to test the beta. We've had one graduate so far, Molly Dworkin from Delaware State University, actually graduated, so we're up and running, and we'd love to have you all participate in that. You do need to be a member of e-extension, so you need to be at a land-grant university that is a member of e-extension, so keep that in mind. And if you're not sure if you are, write me and we can figure that out. Our next two webinars are May 10th and June 7th. The first one on May 10th is irrigation scheduling tools for improved water management and water use efficiency. That will be presented by Alan Andales, Jim Brodowski, and Danny Rogers. That's Colorado State, Texas A&M, and Kansas State. And on June 7th, we have opportunities and challenges associated with the integration of variable rate irrigation and variable rate nitrogen applications in corn. And that will be presented by Tim Shaver from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And please, today we're going to stop at a few points and allow you to ask questions. Please use that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. If you will, the chat button does not get captured, so if you use the Q&A, we can actually capture those questions. And with no further ado, we're going to start with our presentation for today. Today we have Shorna Allred, who is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University. Her research program blends human factors and natural sciences to improve resource management and conservation. The goal of her research is to develop a fundamental understanding of human behavior for the purposes of improving resource conservation and management. An understanding of human, social, political, and psychological processes will enhance our ability to conserve and manage our natural resources and encourage an open, informed exchange of ideas. Along with Shorna, we also have Kaila Thorn, who is a research assistant for the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State. She has contributed to the USDA Northeast Climate Hub since 2015, focusing her work on farmers' perceptions surrounding climate change and ways in which to improve communication between farmers, researchers, and outreach organizations. She is currently working to develop a youth empowerment program as well as evaluation work related to climate change decision support tools for farmers. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shorna and Kaila. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan, and also Brent, for inviting us to be part of the Climate Learning Network webinar series. And thanks to all the participants who have joined us today to talk about discussing climate change with agriculture and natural resource audiences. So as Dan mentioned, I'll be presenting. Kaila Thorn and I will be presenting. So you'll be hearing a little bit from both of us about collaborative studies that we've conducted to really look at the role of ag and natural resource professionals in outreach around climate change. And sustainably managing natural resources in a changing climate is obviously an imperative in terms of both mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and in terms of the changes that have already been observed, as well as the changes that are coming down the line. Natural resource professionals really play an important role in terms of implementing and conducting outreach with regards to climate change mitigation and adaptation at local and regional or other scales. And they also can help pave the way for demonstration efforts or other actions that can help with regard to climate mitigation and adaptation. So today, we will be first talking about a little bit about the role of professionals and educators in climate change. We'll talk about informing decision-making about climate change in the context of natural resources and agriculture. And we'll share results from recent studies about communicating with professionals around climate change in terms of delivery methods. And then we'll also talk about how this information, the research results, can be applied in extension, education, and outreach. And we have a few points within the webinar today that we'll stop and ask for questions to make sure we're able to really respond to what you all would like to get out of the webinar today. So as I mentioned before, climate change really does pose unprecedented challenges both to agriculture production and natural resource management. And of course, those that are very much engaged with land management, from landowners, farmers, and other stakeholders, really play an important role in adapting to climate change for the future. But of course, the decision-making process is very complex and includes a variety of factors, managing risk, managing financial burdens, social concerns, how decisions may fit with their value system or attitudes with regard to climate change. And in terms of extension educators, resource professionals, and a myriad of others that are really doing outreach on the ground really do play this important role in reaching audiences that have a direct stake or role in actually managing lands throughout the U.S. and of course the world. So how we communicate with them is what we'll be sharing a little bit about what we've learned through our studies. We'll be sharing that with you today. So one study that I wanted to draw your attention to is a meta-analysis that we conducted of looking at farmer agricultural stakeholder views and decisions on climate change. And this was a meta-analysis of the published literature on U.S. agriculture stakeholder views and decisions on climate change. So it was focused on farmers and ranchers in various regions of the United States. And what we found was that the majority of farmers believe that the climate is changing, but many remain, results of these studies conducted all across the U.S. Reveal that many farmers and ag stakeholders remain skeptical of the issue and were uncertain about the anthropogenic causes of climate change. And farmer climate mitigation and adaptation decisions varied widely and were really correlated with beliefs or other factors such as personal experience with extreme weather. So the idea that someone had experienced extreme weather did play a role in their decision-making process. And of course, understanding farmer views and actions and issue framing had important implications for both extension educators and policymakers. And so a result of this comprehensive analysis of the extant literature about this subject revealed that farmer decision-making around climate change happens in these 6 domains around environmental factors such as weather and climate, farm conditions, around social networks and how people around them influence decisions, people like family, peers, people like yourselves that are working perhaps in extension, or educators, researchers in other realms. Also, obviously, consultants and industry representatives. There was also the capacity domain, which was about farmer skills and abilities and financial capital, the ability to apply information and tools to farm level decisions. Also knowledge, which is about both intuition based, the kind of traditional kind of local knowledge that they may have in relation to being a practicing farmer and everything that they learn in the process of doing that, and also research based, and those obviously interact in multiple ways. Also beliefs and perceptions around climate change. As I mentioned, the anthropogenic causes of climate change there was still some uncertainty around that with farmers, and also around risk and regulations. And also the political economic domains such as costs, policies and regulations, and what opportunities there might be. These are obviously not mutually exclusive. They're often interacting. So capacity and knowledge and beliefs, are often interacting against each other, or in some cases, in some ways reinforcing one another. So these were interesting in terms of looking at outreach to farmers and thinking about how outreach might inform these different domains that influence farmer decision-making around climate change. And so potential ways to frame the conversation that this literature review uncovered were ways to frame the conversation around extreme weather, utilizing local examples. This was something that's really come up again and again in different studies that we've done, is really wanting to understand what the local impacts of climate change will be beyond kind of climate models that are looking at very, very large geographies of climate, but how does that apply to, say, what might happen on a particular farm or a particular forest? So really utilizing those local examples of what can be done at a local level that has this broader impact as well. And even being mindful of that the word climate change can be quite controversial. And so are there other ways to enter the conversation so that worldviews are not threatened, and thinking about the belief system of the audiences that you're working with. Another example is to be solution focused versus consequence focused. So rather than focusing on the fact that maybe someone didn't do no-till, focus on ways to improve soil rather than focusing on the consequences of not doing something. What are the incentives or benefits of taking another approach that enhances soil, but also has these other implications that benefit or help to address climate change. Images and metaphors, visualizations, and local examples really are something that really resonates, and peer-to-peer as well, really utilizing farmers who have undertaken perhaps any kind of mitigation activities, any adaptation activities, having them to tell the story, having those local examples that other people can look to as a demonstration, as a example, really is something that in the literature was something that was important in terms of both framing and also communication. So I wanted to share with you another study that we did with, this study was with natural resource professionals. This was done in New York State. It was with a variety of natural resource professionals working in extension, state agencies, federal agencies, land trusts, NGOs, and working on a wide variety of natural resource issues. And we wanted to find out about their climate change awareness, knowledge, beliefs, as well as what actions they had taken in their role as natural resource managers around climate mitigation and adaptation. And so we also conducted a telephone survey of non-respondents to examine any non-response bias that we might have had in the survey, and we did not find any. We had a response rate of 32% to this survey. So one of the things that we asked about in the survey, before we go on to the results of what influenced action, I just wanted to also mention what their beliefs were about climate change. And so one of the questions we asked was how knowledgeable these professionals felt about climate change. And we found that out of the natural resource professionals that we surveyed, about 60% said they feel moderately well informed about climate change. About 20% said they know a little bit, and very few said they, about 10% said they feel very, very knowledgeable about climate change. And so this was something that they didn't necessarily feel that they had a lot of knowledge in, even though they're working on the ground with various aspects of land management and natural resources. We also asked about their their beliefs in climate change and found that 88% agreed or strongly agreed that the science indicates that climate is changing, but slightly less, about 72% said that it's due to anthropogenic causes, and that's even lower when we look at farmers. And so one of the things that we asked about in the survey that you'll see here on this bar chart is what influenced taking natural resource professionals to take action with regard to climate adaptation and mitigation. And so it was on a scale of 1 to 5, a 1 being not at all important and a 5 being very important to them taking action. And what was interesting is that we found that proactive leadership was one of the primary reasons that led natural resource professionals to take some type of climate adaptation or mitigation action. And that was comprised of things like being a responsible leader, developing partnerships, being proactive about taking action on climate, cooperating with other agencies. So all the various aspects of being out front and being a leader, being cooperative. The second most important was local impacts. And that was around understanding the impacts of climate change already being felt at the local level. It was about concerns about social equity, the perceived threat, understanding that the scientific evidence of climate change is real, and about impacts and threat being perceived at the local level. So that was interesting, that it was really about leadership and really feeling those impacts at the local level that was really driving action. And of course, fiscal savings was something that was also important in terms of the fiscal savings that are associated with things like mitigation actions that might reduce greenhouse gases through, say, energy, lowering energy emissions. Pressure to act and inaction of government were not as important as drivers of action. So pressure to act was constituent pressure to take action or a mandate from above, and inaction of government was, did you take action because there was a lack of action, say at the federal or state level? That did not seem to be a primary driving factor. So proactive leadership was critical, observing local impacts, and having the evidence of savings or other fiscal benefits. We also asked about what were some barriers to action, and found that barriers were primarily around resources and lack of resources. That particular, this is a composite item that was made up of questions about human resource capacity, so not having enough staff for new initiatives around climate change and not having funding. And financial costs were associated with the cost of actually implementing mitigation and adaptation projects, the costs of mitigating greenhouse gases, and also the fact that savings are not necessarily realized immediately in some cases, and so there's this lag effect. And so those seem to be the two primary reasons that were driving barriers to action. And lack of threat was around not feeling that it's a current issue. So is it lack of perceived threat of impacts at the local level, impacts not being felt at the local level, and really looking at whether there was a perceived threat within their organization that they're working in. So again, barriers to taking action were around lack of resources, both financial resources and the capacity to take on additional outreach responsibilities on top of other things that outreach and other natural resource professionals have on their plate. Cost relative to benefits and the lack of a perceived threat at the local level were some of the major barriers. One of the other questions that we asked on the survey was what natural resource professionals identified as needs to more effectively work on climate change issues. And interestingly, most of the resources that we identified were things that they felt were needed. And the primary tools that natural resource professionals said that they could really utilize in their work were local projections and data. So things like downscaled models that could be applied at the local level, things such as any kind of decision tools and incentives that would help them make informed decisions about lands that are under their management, and also centralized information and information sharing and communication. So like a centralized data management or delivery system, any kind of centralized monitoring systems that could be applied. And so they were very interested in that, model ordinances that could be adopted by local governments, how they might incorporate climate change into existing, this would be more for the agencies, but how they could incorporate climate change into existing regulations or procedures. And so they really wanted information on local climate change impacts and what effective adaptations would be for those. So I wanted to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions, because at this point in the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kaila Thorn, who will talk to you about a study that was specifically about delivery methods for climate change programming. So before we transition to that portion of the webinar, I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions before I hand it over to Kaila.
And again, if you're interested in asking any questions, please use that Q&A panel on the bottom of your screen and we can get it off to their speakers. Looks like nothing so far, so if you want to move on to Caleb, I think we're good. Oh,
Okay.
wait, we do have one. We got one.
Oh, we got one.
Of course, every time I say that, we get one. So it's surprising to me that more than a quarter of natural resource professionals don't believe climate change is caused by human actions. Any idea why not?
Yeah, so Kaila, you can chime on this too, but I know Allison and I that conducted that study, we were also really surprised by that because it was also mirrored by a study we did with municipal officials. We see the same thing with farmer audiences. So across a variety of different professional groups, you might say, we see the same result, that belief in that climate change is happening is quite high, but belief in anthropogenic causes of that is still much lower. And
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Kaila.
I was going to say, Shorna, can you go back to slide 4 that shows that kind of graphic was used in the literature review? To answer the question, Liz, it's not really an answer, but kind of mirroring what Shorna was saying, because we also found that was true to be in the study that we had done looking at extension specialists, researchers, and extension educators. And I think that this slide highlights it as well. Now, this was specifically used for farmer decision making, but I think all of these factors really play into pretty much everyone's decision when trying to discuss a really conscientious topics such as climate change. So what are the political factors? What are the predetermined beliefs? Where are they getting their knowledge from? And I don't think anyone's horribly wrong or dominantly correct in whether climate change is real or not and for natural resource professionals. But I think the way that you frame the question really determines a lot of that as well.
We have a few more questions that popped up. How important is the messenger with farmer audiences? Do outsiders have any hope of building trust directly with farmers on climate change?
So
I think Sharon, if you've got something to chime in on that.
Oh, just one quick point is that I think peers are really important in outreach with audiences, whether it's a farmer or landowner. So it's not that outsiders can't have an impact, but I do think that peer-to-peer outreach, peer educators really can play an important role as someone trusted that's already in the social network of that individual. And a lot of times that can be, those individuals can sometimes reinforce incorrect information, but they can also, if they're trained, they can actually help promote a more science-informed message or discussion.
I also think that the outsiders can have a chance of building even that direct trust with farmers, but it needs to be done through those peer networks that Shorna just talked about. So going to, if Extension is that local connection to a farmer, going through Extension as an outsider to start building up the basic layer of trust and continuously going to them, looking for information as much as sharing information. So I think it's the same trust building techniques that you would use with most people, but you need to have that peer connector in order to start the conversation with farmers.
That's right. And Extension is, in a lot of studies, comes out still as a very trusted, source of information for people across communities. So Extension does play a critical role. Absolutely.
All right, I think at this point,
Yeah.
Let's have Kaila go ahead with hers. We're going to save the rest of these until the end, but we will get to them, I promise, with the questions. One question that was asked that we can answer quickly is this study on slide 4 available to review?
Yes.
Yes, and we actually... Yeah, go ahead, Kaila. You put those in there.
I was going to say at the end of our slide, we actually have, or end of our presentation, we have a list of helpful resources, and I believe that study is listed there in the helpful resources. So if they have a way to get a hold of the study at the end, or the slideshow at the end, then they can.
We'll post the slide. Can we post these slides? Are you okay with that?
Yes.
I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I'm fine with
Great.
that.
Yeah, so we'll post these slides along with the recording of this tomorrow, so you'll be able to get everything off of that tomorrow. So yeah, so we have 3 more questions here, and let's save those until the end, and Kaila, take it over.
All right, so I'm going to try and keep mine nice and concise because we really want this to be more about the questions that you guys have. So the study that we did, the paper specifically was looking at the usefulness of delivery methods for climate change programming, perspectives of extension and research faculty. This is part of a much larger study that was done across 16 land-grant universities across the Northeast. What we discovered from that previously mentioned literature review is that regionally speaking, there was a lack of information being shown for the Northeast. So I know many of you are present with the Southeast, but looking at the Northeast specifically, we needed to have some answers on what was happening at the colleges of agriculture across the land-grant universities. So out of that study, we sent a survey out to 3,757 people, just over 1,200 responded. And then from there, we decided to place in that criterion that individuals had to indicate at least or dedicate at least 1% of their work to climate change. And so in having that specification, we brought our respondents down to 554. Those respondents consisted of extension specialists, extension educators, and research faculty across those 16 land-grant universities in the Northeast. Let me pull up a little bit more about who has responded. We had about 44% research faculty respond, and just over 48% of extension educators or extension faculty. So we had a pretty even split between extension representation and research representation. All right, so that study specifically took a look at a lot of different factors. We looked at barriers, we looked at key influencers, but we specifically talking about today are looking at delivery methods. Within that delivery methods component, we broke it into 2 different forms or 2 different ways that those delivery methods were sharing information. First one was disseminating information, and the second one were delivery methods that were better suited for changing practices or behaviors. And so the study revealed that respondents really thought that overall, all of the delivery methods were better suited to disseminate information compared to changing those practices or behaviors. This isn't very surprising. I'm sure it's not surprising to many of you because in order to change a behavior, you need to have a little bit more than just pamphlets going out. You need to have more time invested into individuals to really see a behavior change. So out of a list of 14 items of those delivery methods, the top ones for disseminating information, for sharing knowledge and spreading knowledge, were shown to be field tours, videos, websites, and workshops. So kind of a blend between different methods of delivering content in order to share knowledge. When thinking about how to go about changing practices or behaviors, field tours and workshops were dominating that area. And again, it's not very surprising because both field tours and workshops, you're having face-to-face interaction, you're building up those networks of trust that we were just talking about. So it's really important if you're looking to change behaviors that you're able to start working on that trust. You're able to see some vulnerability with folks. All right, Shona? So here's an image. It's not quite in the paper itself, but you can see the list of different delivery methods. Everything from social media, meetings, radio programs, peer-reviewed publications. The way that this slide is showing them, we've got light colors that are indicating the usefulness to changing practices and behaviors. Dark colors are indicating the usefulness for disseminating information. And you can kind of, they're then broken into 3 color groups, with the green being more specific to face-to-face interaction, things like our field tours or workshops, and then even formal classes, short classes. Blue is the mass media, radio programs, videos, internet, or online fact sheets. And then orange is the traditional media. I think I have those switched on, that's why it doesn't quite make sense there, but you get the idea. We broke them into three different forms that information is going to be shared. You can go on to the next slide. So when we were taking a look at these, our 3 different responder groups of research faculty, extension specialists, and extension educators, we found no significant differences amongst those 3 groups. However, when we were taking a breakdown of traditional written and media delivery methods compared for disseminating information, we were really able to see that traditional forms were much better suited for disseminating information opposed to face-to-face or online forms. And so this just indicates that out of our land grant respondents, individuals prefer traditional media for exchange of knowledge. When we ran further tests, extension educators indicated a significant difference for face-to-face, a preference for face-to-face delivery methods when it came to changing behavior, when it came to changing practices. And so this is, again, not surprising, especially for extension educators that are in the audience right now. Face-to-face interactions, having a chance to have a conversation, have a handshake with an individual in the room with you is going to make a much greater impact for changing those behaviors. And it's something that extension educators, by the nature of your job, are going to be more inclined to do compared to research faculty or even extension specialists. Next slide. Here are just some of the graphs that showcase that. So when looking at traditional mass media, we can see that there was significance for that form of delivery methods compared to online mass or face-to-face. And next slide. And again, here you can see a difference when you're looking over at face-to-face interactions between educators and specialists. And this is quite likely due to the nature of their jobs. Extension educators are intended to be out talking with community members more directly than extension specialists. And next slide. So what does all of this mean? Essentially, it means that traditional media formats are going to be a great way for disseminating information. Face-to-face are going to be more preferred for changing practices and behavior. And this isn't surprising when you take a look at some of the back work that's been done and ways to kind of try and play around with the positions that people have. So Procopy and Power did some very strong studies in the Midwest and determined that extension specialists and researchers who don't traditionally have a chance to interact with individuals one-on-one or even in a face-to-face method, perhaps having some of their climate change work, having some other interaction work promoted through promotion and tenure is a way to kind of interject into the system and have them connecting with folks through the system itself. For extension educators and outreach individuals, finding a balance for your audience between whether you're trying to disseminate information or if you're changing behaviors, finding that balance between the resources that you have. So if it has to be online, that's great for information dissemination, but perhaps take a couple of individuals to really go have a face-to-face interaction with. You're going to have a better chance of cementing the knowledge that you just shared, but also building up those trust networks to be able to change a behavior. Again, we talked about it with the target audiences. Your jobs are going to have you interacting with people in different ways. And so using the benefits of the electronic methods, but pairing them with face-to-face interactions so that you can really change behaviors and get people engaged in the electronic or in traditional methods, depending on what your resources have, can be a great way to connect with your audience, but also not drain the financial or time issues that everyone faces, but particularly extension educators and outreach. And then lastly, extension educators are the ones that are interacting with folks. They're constantly evaluating whether you're doing it informally or formally. You know what kind of interaction works well with the farmer. If you're meeting them for the first time, or perhaps you've worked with them for over 5 years, you know what kind of interactions are going to start to lead towards behavior change. So really hone in on them and share that, have that voice shared with extension specialists. And then on the flip side, have extension specialists work with educators to understand what methods are working for your local community specifically. As Shorna had mentioned earlier, all of the studies, any other offshoot studies from our work, shows the importance of having locally specific information. So I think that's down to my questions or comments.
Okay, great.
And also just before we into those, the last section of our slides are really going to be showing some specific examples, and then we have those prompts. So we will get to some specifics and how all of this can be applied to you locally.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start reading off some of the questions we have from the last section. If you have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A section. The first one says, I'm planning a focus group with farmers to explore messages and practices to build resiliency. Any suggestions? It's a pretty big question.
So I did something similar with a focus group with farmers, not looking at necessarily building resiliency. But my first suggestion, and I'm not sure quite what your position is, but if you are hesitant about reaching out to any of your farmers, I would definitely try and contact somebody local. And so either the extension person, or perhaps you are extension and you still just can't seem to reach this group of farmers, go to the local organization, as their Corn Growers Association, start reaching out to folks that might be interested. And then that could be a way to build in people who are open to listening to you, but then can also create their own doorways so that you can talk to other farmers.
All right. The next one is, regarding the need for local projections and data, would this be examples of other communities to use as a template, information and procedures, or of the local community being studied or communicated with? So I'm trying to put that, there's some words missing in that sentence I'm trying to fill in here, so.
Okay, let me see that again. The examples. Oh, I wonder if they're looking for examples?
Maybe. Yeah, okay, so I don't know how the word need fits in there, so I would say the local projections and data would be examples that other communities could use as a template, correct?
Yeah, I'm wondering.
We may need a little more clarification on that question. I'm kind of confused what you're looking for. So if you want to go ahead and clarify on the bottom, we'll get to it. The next one, some of our rainfall data has been lowered, such as Q5, Q10 storm events, but the more intense rainfalls, say for a Q100, has been increased in our spreadsheets. I believe it points out the highly variable weather.
Yeah. That's a really good point, and I think that in our research we're finding that extreme weather is one way that people are kind of seeing evidence of local climate impacts. And in some of the studies that we've done with the general public, we're finding that regardless of, say, political orientation, liberal versus conservative on that spectrum, that experiencing extreme weather, experiencing those local kind of impacts will drive people to act to address those. And so we're finding that extreme weather events are kind of one way to enter into the conversation that people may be more receptive to. So this high variability in the weather obviously has some very negative consequences, but also provides an opportunity to enter into conversation and action where it might not be possible otherwise.
And I'm going to use this comment to also touch base with the individual who's setting a focus group with farmers. This is another great way to connect with farmers and build up trust once they are at the focus group. However, you're setting your questions around resiliency, but using those local examples. So if you did have an extreme weather event or with extreme precipitation, citing that of, 2 years ago, we had that rainstorm in July, and this is what came of it. That's a great way to engage the local context, and then also learn about what kind of techniques those farmers use to manage and handle that situation.
Okay, we have clarification on that prior question. It said, to clarify about local projections, are you talking about using the local information and projections from other communities as examples? Or are you talking about gleaning and utilizing information and data for the community that you are doing outreach to, or both?
For the way that we asked about it in the one study that I mentioned that we conducted in New York State, it was finding about, it wasn't necessarily using other communities as examples, but having models that were applicable at the local level that they could utilize, that were populated with data at a smaller scale than, say, some of the climate models that are looking at global temperature. But I think also having examples from other communities could also be quite useful. But the way we asked about it in the survey was really downscaled models was the way that we were looking at it.
All right, we have another question. Well, this is more of a comment, but I think it's useful. At my place of work, we are working on creative positive experiences to change beliefs, and I'm applying this principle in all the areas of my life and have made good progress working with various groups. So I think what they're saying is using examples, real world examples, really is a great way to get this to work.
I would fully agree that both real world examples, as well as, we keep pointing it out, but as localized as you can get. That connects back to the individual experiences that people have had, and that's what starts to really change whether your belief or behavior, any component of it. They're going to remember they're going to go with what they know, or typically, which you also find with farming populations, is they're going to go with what kind of the family or tradition says they should go with.
Yeah, and I would also add to that never underestimate the power of a compelling story. And so the stories
yes.
of experiences of whether they're your own in terms of changes you're making in your own life, or the workplace, or farmers sharing with other farmers, landowners sharing with other landowners, those are always really effective, because speaking from that firsthand experience is something that isn't political, it's not controversial, it's your own experience. And so it's your truth, it's your reality, and sharing that is often a really nice way to connect with others.
All right, we have another question about yardsticks. How did researchers measure changes in behavior, the change in practices, with whom, and the time frame to measure that change in behavior?
It is a very good question, and one that we did not actually, not even address, but our study was looking at the perceptions of research faculty, extension specialists, and extension educators. So what did they perceive as being useful delivery methods for changing behaviors and for changing practices? So that was purely their perception of it. in order to go about measuring change in behavior and change in practices, that's something that would probably be best suited, at least in the short term, for extension educators. And that can be done either through different surveys that educators or outreach set up, or through observational notes over time. So asking questions like, well, what behaviors do you have now in response to heavy precipitation? What have you done, or what are you planning on doing in order to manage this? And so if they have a change in what they plan on doing, then we're starting to see a little bit of that behavior change, or a little bit of the practices change. It usually is most helpful when you can really see it over time, because you always have the intentions of people of what they want to do in order to manage impacts from climate change. But really over time is when you can start to see how they have actually gone about changing that behavior, or if they have not.
Mm-hmm. And in the study that we did around looking at what actions natural resource professionals were making, we did not put a time frame on their behaviors. So we asked, have you ever done this in your professional capacity? And it was things around conducting outreach and education on climate change, working with or forming partnerships, providing funding. We looked at monitoring and collecting data, developing any kind of comprehensive planning or adaptive management, making investments to realize energy savings. So we had a list of 12 different actions that they could have taken with regard to climate change in their professional capacity, and they indicated whether they had done that or not. So that's how we measured the action variable, the behavior variable, and looked at what influenced those actions and what were the barriers to that.
Also on that question, when you see later on in the slides the helpful resources, we have the Climate Hub's website on there. And I know for sure the Northeast is highlighting some of more of the stakeholders, the farmers and natural resources, what behavior changes they have made in different studies. And I would not be surprised if the Southeast has similar work going on, but I'm not as certain.
All right, we have another question. If you do not have the audience reach on the ground when the audience needs face-to-face communication, do recorded or live videos work as well?
I think they can work. I think the first question you have to really know is, who is your audience? So we did a study later on that was talking to farmers about their preferred delivery methods, specifically in Pennsylvania. And we found with our older population that the face-to-face is really important. Having or setting up demonstration sites is really helpful. But if you have a younger audiences, some of them really prefer going on Facebook Live or checking out some other form of social media. And so I think that's a question that I would start probably with the live videos and just have them recorded for individuals, but then constantly be looking for feedback. So ask your audience if they liked that format or if they would have preferred it in some other way.
All right, moving on to the next question. Differences in gaining rapport and with and influencing regular farmers versus newcomers who may have urban backgrounds, locavore orientations, different environmental ideologies, etc. So basically, how do you communicate with traditional farmers versus some of the new farmers that are emerging today?
Our slide coming up here on helpful resources is really gonna be helpful. So we did one study that the Pennsylvania study I was just talking about really looked more of those regular or more traditional farmers. And that was just the population that responded to the survey. They were older individuals, they were predominantly male, they were traditional farming families. And so that study indicated more of a preference towards that traditional communication method. We're going to highlight here in just a minute studies that have been shown in other audiences with young farmers, with farmers that are tech savvy, folks with urban backgrounds, different things like that, that have just a different preference for communication. And so the more that you can do to get to know your farmers or get to know your target audience, whoever you're working with, the better you'll be able to understand what form of communication they have a preference for. But then you'll also be able to really kind of own into which communication form you are good at. And you can kind of find that middle ground with the individuals. People want information, they want help, and so they're willing to give a little bit as long as you're creating those tiny little trust layers with everybody. So if they have an urban background and you do not, use it as an opportunity to learn from them. Because you're learning from them opposed to telling them everything, they're going to be more likely to try and engage with you in other topics.
Kaila, that was a good segue actually into the next part of our the webinar.
Perfect.
So I wonder if you want to talk about this slide, and then we could go into the questions for discussion right after that.
Sure. So this slide was really just a way for us to show that understanding your audience, and this is done more specifically with farmers, but whoever your audience may be, can really be helpful in finding the best communication method, the best terminology, the languages, all of those little nuanced things. But understanding your audience is helpful. And so to kind of give some examples of that, you can see that small-scale farmers in Oklahoma had a preference for direct mailings. And these studies, if you're familiar with the Journal of Extension, just Googling different communication, delivery methods, a couple of other keywords, you're able to find these short little studies that can kind of give you a little bit of examples if you're trying to connect with urban farmers or if you're specifically looking to work with older farmers. So in Oklahoma, they preferred direct mailings. Another study looking at young farmers in Florida had a preference for internet and social media. I know there's at least one farmer in New York that I've talked to who really, really enjoys her Facebook group. There's a group of other northern New York farmers, and they are able to communicate on Facebook much more effectively than they are in any other format. So looking at North Carolina, older forest landowners prefer mail-based, again, that more traditional method, whereas younger forest landowners have a preference for mail-based and web-based information. The study that I mentioned about Pennsylvania, they had a preference for print newsletters. Those, again, were individuals between 50 and 70 years of age predominantly. And so if you have a particular audience and you don't know how to connect with them, looking for some other studies that have been done, it does seem to work a little bit on the younger side, seem to prefer internet, social media networks. The older individuals seem to prefer a more traditional method, which isn't surprising, but it can be helpful in figuring out how to connect with them. And then also being mindful of your own resources, both economics and time, you can start to develop a little bit of blend. So if you're able to engage some older landowners through traditional methods at the start, then you can start setting them up with webinars or having some of those live chats later on after you started building up the trust with a method that they had a preference for.
Yep. Okay, great. And one of the things that we wanted to spend the last few minutes of the webinar on today is hearing from those of you on the webinar what you have found to be helpful with outreach to professionals on climate change, because there is a lot of expertise out there in the audience in terms of this topic, and we wanted to also use this as an opportunity for you to share ideas or programs that you might have that have worked well with the audience of professionals that are here on the webinar. So anything with regard to what you found to be helpful, kind of delivery methods. Kaila talked about, all of the different preferences for how to receive information, whether, it's older versus younger, farmers, landowners. So having a sense of maybe what you found to be helpful in your work around this topic.
So should we go back into some of these questions?
I think we can. We've only got a handful of minutes left, so
yes,
we're looking really for any sort of questions.
So let's knock some of these out. We have 4 left here. So we had one in the chat that said, how accurate or long do preferences studies hold up for? I was wondering that too, because as that aging population ages out, some of the, people like my age, would be moving into that group and probably would prefer online. So yeah, how do you keep track of that evolution?
I had this question, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, actually, Dan, at the hub meeting. One of the components of the Pennsylvania study that I can address specifically, so that audience was primarily 50 to 70 years of age. And one of the questions that we asked them is, do they plan on retiring in the next 5 years or so? And so that's anybody within that age range could be looking at retirement. And the dominant answer there was that none of them were looking to retire soon. And so unfortunately, that's one of the components of the older farming audience specifically, is that there is a challenge bringing in new people. There is a challenge keeping the tradition alive and having their children continue on with the farm. And so actually that older population is still going to be part of the conversation for, I think, a little bit longer than anticipated. And then these studies are continuously happening. The Prokopi, who did a study with Arbuckle in the Midwest, they found some really great data about 10 years ago, and I just went to a talk that one of the co-authors had led, and they're talking about redoing the study. It's been 10 years, so it's time to ask these questions again. And so I think that's one thing that's important for researchers to be mindful of, is to continuously update the information as long as it's feasible.
All right, we do have some of the suggestions from our viewers here. So one viewer said, farmers like data and our scientists at presenting them with evidence and letting them decide. 100-year storm events that move a lot of soil or wash out crops that need to be replanted. It's all presenting evidence in the form of stories at farmer meetings that seem to work best, in my opinion. And then we had a comment about what you just said. Working with NRCS staff on a project, I found them to be very keyed into workshop format, but not big on following us on Twitter. And many of them are in their 30s and 40s. And I've seen some of that data too, where some of the younger farmers still aren't that interested in social media. They still want the old delivery methods. So maybe we're going to see a return back to the old delivery methods. Who knows? I mean, that's a real possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's
I know
something to be mindful of.
It is. I mean, technology is changing rapidly, but at least with landowners and with farmers that are in the older age brackets, they still prefer the direct mail written materials. So it's still holding on. Snail mail.
Just highlights the importance of knowing the people that you're working with.
Yes.
Here's a really good comment, and this I've found to be true too.
Yeah.
AM radio still has large influence in very rural areas, and that is so true.
That is
very,
very accurate.
Think about, right? I mean,
No, we don't even think about that usually. And I mean, a lot of rural areas, I know in New York State, there's quite a few rural areas that don't have internet access.
There you go. And there's,
that was
go ahead.
Another point that, depending on what the socioeconomics, what the finances of are your farmers. So it's a heck of a lot cheaper to own an AM radio than it is to own the latest iPhone. And so being mindful of that component as well. If they're out in the field, they're going to be looking for some sort of hands-off way of exchanging information, and radio is a great tool for doing so.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 2 minutes and 4 more questions. So let's plow through these.
Okay.
So this is going back to our earlier discussion. Is it more extreme weather events or because of the denser nature of our people populations that we have noticed these climate changes? That's a big one.
That's a big one. I would say yes. I would say we are having the data, the climatologist data is showing more extreme weather events, but then you pair that with our population density. And regardless of where an individual stands on the climate change belief, or whether it's real, any other components of that, our population demographic right now is being impacted by extreme weather events. And so you can have the conversation either amongst yourselves or with your audiences. But the end fact is that we are being very negatively impacted by it.
Yes. especially coastal areas, because a lot of the denser populations are actually on the coast where we're seeing more extreme weather events happening. So that there is that relationship between those, I think.
All right, perception and the change in behavior. Is there a strong relationship between conservation planning and climate adaptation planning to adoption of the? So how did conservation planning, climate adaptation planning, when you do this together, does that lead to adoption of both, I guess?
I don't know if I can properly answer that with that separation there.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're seeing in another study that we're kind of looking at least what municipalities are doing. We are seeing more like climate smart cities and things like that are looking comprehensively at all lands in their municipality, and that inherently involves looking at conservation as well, and kind of how that links up with land use planning. So what you do with wetlands in your community and how that interacts with development. And so we are seeing more municipalities doing more integrated planning, and we have a study right now where we're looking at climate adaptation plans around the country and how that fits with beliefs, but we don't have the results yet.
All right, another question.
That could be another example of the language that's used when it comes to what you're planning and preparing for.
Right.
Here's another one. Do many extension professionals talk about or deal with land conservation and protection issues in relation to climate change? I guess that one's pretty similar, really.
Yeah, that was similar to what we answered, I think.
And with the
much integrated.
Yeah, they're well integrated. When we did the survey looking across the 16 land grants in the Northeast, we really brought our numbers down when we specified the 1 to 20% of your time is spent dealing with climate change. And so climate change specifically, I don't think we have a vast number of individuals. In our particular survey, we had just over 500 respond to that out of 3,000. But I think when you start looking at the more nuanced components of climate change, but with the different wording, then I think you start to see more people.
So the last two we have here are comments regarding your questions earlier, so I think this is a great way to end this. This one's pretty great. They said they came from an extension university background, and their former boss, who is an area agent, would bring in young and upcoming meteorology experts to talk to older ranchers, a group of professionals and federal agencies. And they said that it worked well for a mixed audience to have a youthful weatherman who was a PhD tell them what they already knew. So,
yep.
I think that's almost a great conclusion to this.
That is.
Yes.
We'll do one more here. Said, working for NRCS, I actually presented storm info in person, explaining to a farmer client that the localized rainfall event was a 320-year storm that affected his newly installed conservation practices. So the NRCS agent went out there and said, hey, the reason they didn't work this year is because we had a 320-year storm event. Now the question is, and this isn't part of their question, but I say, are we going to have more of this 320-year storm events?
Yes.
That's the question, and that's the problem, right? So that is another great way to end this discussion.
Yes.
That's right. Thank you for those comments.
Yep.
So I think that, like I said, it's a great place to wrap this up. If you're interested in these slides, we'll have the recording of this and those slides available tomorrow on climatewebinars.net, the portal through which you got here. We have two more webinars coming up next month and the month after. Those will be also advertised there as well. And again, if you're interested in that climate literacy certification, you can email me, dgeller@uga.edu. I put that in the chat if you're looking for that email. I'd like to thank both Shorna and Kaila for their participation today. I think this is a really great webinar. I really enjoyed it. And actually, thank all of you today, too, because you guys really participated well and added to the conversation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, for being here, and Dan for the invitation to be part of the webinar series.
And with that, we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.